started, and I'm very conscious we're also being live streamed. So there's, I think, about 40 people, Phil, watching at a distance. So I'd like to welcome you in the room in Lancaster University Library, and those in their own rooms tuning in to day 2 of Lancaster University Library Festival. We are about to be in conversation with the great Barry Lucas, and then this evening we have an evening of music and conversation. So when I say we're in conversation now with the great Barry Lucas, if you were growing up in the 70s into the mid 80s, you probably knew Lancaster University, particularly if you're a music fan, for one reason, because it was the great gig venue of the North. So it is a great pleasure for me to welcome and introduce Barry and his book, which is still on sale. Barry, there's 60 copies left, and where can we buy them?
Carnegie publishing in based in Scotford or Carnforth Bookshop. Well, we're not selling them through Amazon anymore. Although we did reach number 70 in the Amazon charts.
I'm not surprised. So Barry, we're going to take you back to a time that's a very happy time for any of us who love music, and can be displayed and seen in the exhibition we've got over there, to a time when you came to what was then a very new university. But I want to take you back to before then and ask you, how did you get into music? What music were you into, and how did you end up at Lancaster?
I was a teenager in the 60s, so how could I not be into music? You know, it was the prerequisites of being young in the 60s. I had quite a Catholic taste in music at that time. I like the Rolling Stones, but I also like Frank Sinatra. Eventually, I was brought up in Leeds. I went down to sixth form in Cheltenham Grammar School. My dad moved down there, and it was horrendous because you had to wear a mortarboard and a cape, having come from a place where the sixth formers were allowed to wear their own clothes. So it was quite a culture shock. So I wanted to get back up north. I wanted to get back up north to a big city. So I put all the university I could in the UCA form, which was like 6 choices. And I was in the sixth form common room thing and started out, anybody know of the university? And somebody said Lancaster, so that was my 6th choice. And the deputy head of the school was asking me, he was a rugby teacher, and we're playing rugby, and he said, what are you doing next year? So I'm going to university, I'm going to college. So he said, oh, where are you going? I said, Lancaster. He said, oh yeah, it's good, teacher training college. But he looked horrified, the idea that I would end up as one of his profession. So anyway, I ended up at Lancaster, and it was 68, so it was the first year that there was any teaching and residence on campus, because it opened in 65, and that was in Leonard's House in Lancaster.
So I have to point out, of course, that Cheltenham was home to Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones. There was some music there, but not much. So you come to Lancaster in 68, the White Album, the year of the kind of Paris and student protests. What was it like?
It was peculiar if you're a first year at Lancaster, because all first years were out living in town. Nobody was allowed to have a residence room on campus. It was all 3rd year preference. And actually it worked, because I was stuck in a house in South Road in Lancaster with 11 others. So you immediately had 12 people you sort of knew, you know, so you got to know people. And when you were wandering around campus, you grabbed at them, them, go and sit with them a coffee and things like that. So it sort of broke down the tendency quite often when first years came back onto campus. So they got my 3rd year, I think they ended up with all first years had to be on campus. And I was chairman of the cricket club at Lancaster, and we were meeting cricketers playing in the summer term who hadn't been to Lancaster. Been to Lancaster University, but they've never been to Lancaster.
So one thing you said to me when we talked previously, one of the things that's often forgotten is that life at Lancaster University was possibly more about Morecambe than about.
Yeah, it was. 90% of those students that were out on those first year students who were out there lived in Morecambe, and usually in the B&Bs, because the B&B, obviously the summer season, there was no students here, but they could rent. So the landladies got a nice income from renting out their rooms to students from October to June, and then the normal holiday train, which was dying, at the time.
So you come to the university, and as we've kind of touched on, the music scene at that period was on fire. 68, you've got the White Album, you've got Beggars Banquet, you've got Jimi Hendrix, you've got Bob Dylan's, John Wesley Harding, Traffic, loads of great stuff. What music was happening here at the university? Was there anything?
Yeah. But the music in 68, I mean, we had summer ball, graduation balls, but they were in the courtyard in Lonsdale College. They put a big circus tent over the top, but they had bands like Family and that were headlining there. But as far as not day to day, week to week things, they tended to be in the refectory. So it'd be Bowland or Lonsdale Refectory, and then Cartmel had the lecture theatre open. So there would be that kind of thing, and it'd be bands like Groundhogs and Pretty Things and Edgar Broughton Band, blues-based rock bands, basically.
So what was your first experience of music where you thought, oh, I like this, when you were kind of sat?
It was in Bowland College, actually. They had a little stage, very similar to this, except it was not carpeted, it was just wood. And Dunbar Retaliation, which are a blues black band around that time, like Fleetwood Mac were as well. And I was sat on the floor at the lead guitarist's feet, and I had I had 3/4 of a pint of beer, and it put it on there. And I was watching this lead guitar doing all these breaks, and thought, this is amazing, it's great. So I went to pick my pint up, and it was no longer a pint; it was just a whole clump of froth. And there's about that much beer in the bottom, because the vibrations of set it up and emptied it on the stage. But I thought, hey, this is good. I like this.
So when did it go from sitting on the stage, I like this, to getting other people on the stage?
It was my second year. The Great Hall opened in the start of my second year in October '69, and the first band, in our terms, band to play there was Fairport Convention. The classical music were putting a lot of stuff on there, and some of it's excellent. They had Johnny Danforth and Cleo Lane that I went along to see, and that. Each college had its own social committee. There was no centralised student union. Well, it was called an SRC, but it basically had no power at all. It was just a meeting place for all the college presidents. The real power was the college presidents, so the social committee was treated very much like a society. So they were given a grant to spend, to lose over the course of the year. And so they'd use that money. It was just something like £350 or whatever. Now, that doesn't sound very much, but £350 in those days would have bought you Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin. So Bowland College announced that they'd got £600 to spend on their Great Hall concert that term. And so everybody's really, what on earth are they going to get for £600? And they came up with the foundations, which, as I say, is probably more kudos today than it had at the time. Just for us, who were brought up on what was called underground then, with Melody Maker and me, they was top of the pops. So they were just bubblegum music. Anyway, everybody went nuts to spend all this money on this. So my friend at the time was stood as social sec against that social sec on elections and persuaded me to stand for Lonsdale, and I got elected for Lonsdale. And then Furness College didn't know what to do with their money, so we dragged them in, because we thought, if we've got £350 each, that means we've got £700 to spend on the band, and then we could drag Furness in. We've got £1,000 to spend on a band. So I know it's weird now to think back, but I mean, I was 19 years old. I thought, oh, what can we get? And I don't know. What about the Who? So yeah, we'll get the Who. So we just phoned up the Who, and yeah. Well, phoned up this agent and said, can you get us a Who? So I said, yeah. Got us a Who. He said, it'll cost you £1,000 and 50 quid for me for the phone call. So I said, fine, And our two college presidents, Lonsdale and Bowland, were absolutely going nuts. We're bankrupting the colleges. It'll be a disaster. We'll lose fortunes. So we ended up booked a band called Quintessence for 150 quid, and somebody else for 100 quid on the back of it. And they were actually running across the square as we were sticking a signed contract into the post office, which was in this corner next to the entrance to the library. And I mean, Morris, my president at Lonsdale, I didn't know him at the time, became a very good friend, and still friends to this day. We stuck the Who up, and it sold out, and there were proper ticket touts on the spine. God knows where they got tickets from around the place selling tickets, and somebody went, "Ooh, might work this."
So for context, this is 1969. You mentioned Fairport Convention, so they would have been touring Legion Leaf. Sandy Denny would have been lead singer still. So the one we all think about, when it comes to Fairport. And then the Who, 1969, 70. So 6 months or so after they played Woodstock.
Yeah. I mean, it was the tour that they did live at Leeds. Should have been live at Lancaster, but unfortunately, whoever designed the Great Hall loading bay didn't do it for rock and roll recording studios, because they couldn't get the recording studio in through the entrance, so it became live at Leeds.
So what do you remember about what should have been live at Lancaster in terms of Daltrey, Townsend? Moon would have been playing there the whole evening.
Oh, it was really, the scary bit is they had a road manager called John Wolfe, and he was bald-headed, and he looked vicious, and he was a real pain in the butt. We had to have 12 follow spots, and it's a follow spot. So he said, "I've got a showing going on with that." So I went to Nuffield Theatre and I borrowed 12 follow spots off them, and they're on the balcony. And in those days, we put people on the balconies on the floor as well. So the 12 follow spots all around there. Now, people who have seen night shows today with all the boards and all of that, no, there was a 3-amp plug, and you plugged it in. So when Mr. Wolfe went, you plugged it in, and then he went and you pulled the plug out. So 12 students, that was it. But I'm going to go in his dressing room and talking to Townsend, and said, Daltrey, and I said, "He's a nightmare, that guy." And I said, "Oh no." Townsend said, No, he's not. He said, "Once you get to know him, he's really good." And Daltrey said, "Yeah, but we've been with him for 5 years and we don't know him yet." Show ended. In those days, believe it or not, all the shows used to go until 2 in the morning. God knows why. And so you'd always have at least 3 bands on the bill. And so the Who went back in the state. We didn't have any. We had one hotel in Lancaster, which was the Royal King's Arms, and the band was staying there. And May 70 was the height of the Vietnam War, and there was a big contingent of American students at Lancaster. I don't know whether there still is or not. And they'd organised an all-night protest vigil in Dalton Square. And it's quite convenient because Dalton Square in those days had a big underground toilet, so they could all sit around there. Anyway, the Who went back to their hotel at about 1:30 in the morning now. And said to the night porter, "Oh, can you make us some sandwiches and teas and coffees?" So he said, "Oh, great." When you're rushing around, I'm making the Who, all this teas and coffees and everything. So Daltrey and Townsend got it all loaded up on trolleys and wheeled it all down to Dalton Square, and we're dishing it out to all the demonstrators, and sat with them for about 2 hours chatting away about the politics of the situation. And that, yeah, it would be nice to think rock and roll stars did that today.
Yeah. I think Townsend still is sometimes is known to do things like that, but you're right, more generally, definitely. So it's 1970. You're co-funding this. How did it go from, "Ooh, this works," to then the professional?
So I continued, and so I got elected halfway through my second year, and Gaz had as well. We then sort of took over the Central Social Committee, the two of us, so we were booked to book the answer there. So I basically was organising the shows. Gaz was like being the front man, and to be fair, he was picking a lot of the acts at that time. We ended up, I mean, we had Floyd. I had Floyd on 3 days before my final.
Can I stop you there, because we were talking about this beforehand, and it turns out that Floyd played the 7th of May, Friday, and both Barry and I had big days that following Monday. He had his finals. I was busy being born, so that really resonated with me. So sorry, I had to say that. Tell us.
Feeling very old.
I feel old then.
So. Yeah, so we did the whole year, and we had Floyd, we had Sabbath, we had Pensangle, we had Eli. So we had a whole term, and we not only didn't we lose money, we actually made money. And the executive, Tim Hamlet, who was the president, came up to see me and said, "If we were to offer you a job doing this, would you take it?" And I said, "You'll never get that. You will never get that sort of general meeting." He says, "What, students giving up the rights on rock and roll shows? They give it over." He said, "No, leave the politics to us. Would you be interested?" I said, "Well, I had a girlfriend who was doing had 1 year left of her degree to do." So I said, "Well, yeah, it works for me. I'll do it for a year," kind of thing. So then I did it on a postgraduate grant, equivalent to the postgraduate grant. So it wasn't a shed load of money in those days, they got it through a general meeting and they offered me the job. I unfortunately destroyed my friendship with Gaz because he thought he should have had it, and they gave it to the person who organised the shows rather than the one who got in front of a mic and said what he was going to do next. So maybe they saw something, I don't know. But I'll stick in one of them, because I know that you're going to ask me about regrets, because people always do. Out of that relationship came one of my biggest regrets, because about 18 months later, I even say they're rare though.
I know.
About 18 months.
Typical librarian.
About 18 months later, I got a letter out of the blue from Gaz, and he was running a bar in London. He said, "I've been running a bar in London, and I've got a flat, and next door flat there's a guy who's looking for a manager." I said, "Yeah, what is he?" And so I wrote back saying, "Oh, sorry," and I told him about you. He'd be interested in meeting you. So I wrote back and said, "Well, who is he?" And he said, "Oh, he's a folk singer." And so then I checked him out, and I thought, "Oh, he's a mime artist, a folk singer." And I thought, "Oh no, if you're going around pubs, or no, I don't want. No, sorry, no, guys, I don't turn it down." Anyway. Wasn't very soon after this that the guy changed his name from Jones to David Bowie. So I could have been sitting on my own Caribbean island that I owned now, instead of the Lancaster Library.
If in doubt, always sign the mime artist. That's the moral of the story there. So Barry, you do say that professionalizing it, getting that role, was the game changer. So what did that look like in terms of what then happened?
It was a game changer. Lancaster had some advantages. One, it didn't have a city hall. It didn't have a venue anywhere near it. Preston didn't have the Guildhall back then. It had a corn exchange that wasn't very popular with things. So the nearest real venue was Blackburn, King George's, or Manchester and Liverpool. Glasgow, Edinburgh up there. So a little bit like Leeds University. Leeds didn't have a hall. They just had their refectory that they put their acts on it. We were sat on the motorway. Not only were we sat on the motorway, we sat on the motorway exit. So you've got you haven't got anywhere to go. So bands coming north, it worked. So we were always going to get acts once we started doing it in a reasonable sized hall. Not massive, but it's one of the biggest student halls. When I say that professionalisation was it wasn't that they gave me the job, it's that they made the job a professional position, because that meant it. In the past, social secretaries got elected. They'd done the social secretary job for a year. They then went into the music business and ripped off all the student unions because they knew how to play the game with student unions. And the student body were training people and then putting them into the opposition to take advantage. It was a ridiculous situation. And NUS used to get me down quite often later on to lecture to presidents of that and union mainly to union managers, saying, "What are you doing? You wouldn't dream of letting an elected student run your shop. You wouldn't dream of electing a student to run your travel agents or your bar. You know, you might have committees around that, but the person actually doing the job is a member of staff responsible to the executive. And those places had turnovers. The first year I did it, I've still got the cutting. It's a Daily Express had a full page on, and you know, it's an editorial page, the editorial down the side. Pop goes £1 million of your taxpayers' money, and that's how much the student unions had lost in that 1971 on pop music. Was £1 million. So, so they said they said that it wasn't making sense getting me, but it wasn't me. It was the fact that I could learn from my mistakes, and I could stop making the mistakes, and I could, you know. And also, people who were social sects that I knew through the circuit and through telephone conversations and conferences, then went into the business, but then they became the top promoters, the top agents, the top band managers, so I could deal directly with them.
So it was a game changer for Lancaster and who you could attract, but also nationally, because you were the first. Yeah,
I was the first. By the time I left, there was about 12 or 13 around the country in some of the bigger unions.
But we were the innovator, and they followed the model. So I'm going to take us through to 1971 now, back end of 1971. There'd been a small beat group from the northwest of England who'd broken up technically the previous year, and end in 71, the NME runs an article on where are the Beatles now and what's happening. And McCartney always tells the story about how he then decided to do something, but I think it's a slightly different version we're going to hear now.
Yeah, it's called The Truth.
Indeed.
But it was, NME ran it was 3 weeks of stories. And the NME was, if you're into music, and back in the day, the NME was the paper to be read. And it was how the Beatles started, their heights, and how they sort of finished, in the sense that after Shea Stadium, they couldn't play anywhere. I mean, if you remember, they flew into New York and they closed New York City. They closed the stock exchange. They closed all the roads and everything. It was just ridiculous. So the Beatles couldn't play anywhere. So McCartney in this story, McCartney had said to the band, why don't we just turn up in village halls as Bert and the Four Bitters and play for 10 shillings? And when the local people turn up in their church hall or whatever, they walk in and the Beatles are there playing. And apparently Ringo was up for it, but surprise, surprise, George and John weren't. So nothing ever happened to it. So I thought, then this was just before Christmas, and I'd got a rag week at the end of March or middle of March. So I phoned up an agent that I'd just been dealing with for a few months now, and she'd booked some of the older acts like John Mayall and that into Lancaster, so she'd been around a long time. I said, can you get hold of Paul McCartney, and can you get to Paul McCartney? And she said, yeah, I used to do a lot of work with the Beatles back in the day. I said, well, I've got this idea, I've got a rag ball on. I knew we'd got Wings together and they hadn't played anywhere, so why don't you come up and I'll just put you on the bill. I won't advertise it, I won't tell anybody, cross my heart and hope to die. And you can rehearse live if you want. And so anyway, she said, well, that's interesting. But yeah, I can get it to him. So I didn't hear anything at all for 3 months. So I presumed, oh well, it was a nice idea at the time. And then on that Monday of Rag Week, there was a phone call. She phoned me up and said, your McCartney date's on. And I went, oh, yeah, that's right. Right, so I went to check on the hall. I don't know why I went to check on the hall, but I just thought nervous that something might happen. I mean, we had the rag ball booked, it was always going to happen. And I came back down to my office, and Alan Murray was a student at the time, but he was giving me some help and hand, and he was learning the ropes. And he said, there's two guys stood in the office in denims and long hair and whatever. Could have been students even. And Alan said, these two guys are Wings Roadies, they want to play here tonight. I went, nah, that's Friday. He said, no, we're here, mate. We want to play tonight. Then I thought, hang on, it's Rag Week. Has this got out anywhere in a rumour? So I said, well, where's the band? Oh, they're up at the Great Hall. So I went across with him to the Great Hall, and Linda McCartney sat on the floor nursing a baby. So I can say that I've held Stella McCartney in my arms. Might not be the way that people might interpret it, but anyway. And Henry McCulloch, Denny Lane, Paul McCartney are playing football, and so introduced, great. Went over to the hall, and there was a classic music concert the next night. So there were these big wooden chairs. They were massive. There's nothing when they were big wooden chairs was the seating for the great hall. Poor old two porters, ex-army men in their middle to late, young lads in their middle 50s, had humped like 300 of these chairs out of the basement cellar, because they didn't have things like lifts in those days. And they said, I said, stop. What? Any minute now, I want to do a show on tonight. And they said, oh, go away, or what's those effects? And I said, no, honest, any second now, Paul McCartney's going to come through those doors, and we want to do a show tonight. And Sid was getting annoyed at this point. I said, don't, you know. And then McCartney came through, and he was great. He was charming. And he sort of said, yeah, you're the two guys we're giving out a text to every, you know, kind of thing. And then sat with them on the stage for about half an hour chatting away. And said, well, what kind of music do you normally get in here? And Sid had said, well, we have proper music normally, classical music, not that rubbish that you play, so sort of thing. So the show was going out. I had the job of, I phoned up a couple of the my ticket agents, because I had 9 ticket agencies all around the Northwest. So I phoned a couple of them up saying, can you somehow get it out, stick a post in the window that, you know, for 50 pence, you're going to see Paul McCartney Wings tonight. So a few got out, but generally speaking, I was walking around with a megaphone around campus saying, honest, Paul McCartney is playing tonight in the Great Hall. I know it's Rag Week, but, you know, sort of thing. So nobody believed me. I mean, but enough people turned up thinking, well, it's worth the risk. My bouncers didn't even believe me, because when we were on the foyer, they were going, this is a really good one. And you've even got PA up on the stage and everything. So it's 50 pence to get in, then we charge them £1 to get out of it for Rag. And I said, oh, Paul McCartney. Anyway, so the general secretary of the executive was a guy called Gray Osterbury, who became a really good friend of mine. He was a poet. He was actually opening poetry for the Doors, and they did the Roundhouse in London that year, or the year before, whatever it was. He was also a son of a miner, and he played rugby league, and he liked to fight and a drink. Anyway, he was doing a miners' benefit in the Bowland Theatre, and they got a small semi-pro band from Manchester to come up and play it. So he said to me, who's gonna come and see this band when you've got the Beatles 100 yards away? He said, this is ridiculous. So I want to see Paul McCartney. And I thought, he's going to plant him one here. So I'd say, calm down. And McCartney listened. He said, no, fine, don't worry. Said, you'll get an audience. So Gray was sort of settled down and went back. And so they did their set. We got to the end. McCartney downstairs said, we can't play anymore. We don't know any more numbers. We've played a whole lot of shaking going on 3 times. You know, we aren't rehearsed enough to do any more, but it's been great. But some mates of ours are playing Bowland Refectory tonight, and we're all going down to watch them because they're really good, you know, and everything. Gray was sat on the door with like one person inside, and all of a sudden 1,100 people came down the spine trying to get into feedback. Trying to get into Bowland Refectory, so I thought that would teach him a lesson. McCartney, in the meantime, got his money and gave a donation back for the miners' strike fund. It was you know, petrol money and that. He was eventually staying in a hotel. He got refused about 3 hotels, but the Midland Hotel wouldn't let him in. You know, long head, scruffy, get out of here, right? I thought, McCartney could buy this place. Anyway, the really good part of the story is that little support band, the band that were playing Bowland Refectory. The guy had taken a day off work so he could come up and set up the gear. So he could ride in his transit van with the Marshall amps in the back. And he saw these guys over by the Great Hall. So he wandered across and said to he said, yeah, I was talking to him later, so to explain the story. He said, I saw these guys playing football. So I went across and said, do you know where Bowland Refectory is? And one of the Scouser guys said to me, no, I've no idea. He said, weren't you here? We've only just stopped here. So he said, I'm in a band and we're playing here tonight. And this guy said to me, "Oh, well, we're in a band as well, and we're looking to play it tonight." So he said, so I said to this guy, Scouse, I said, "Look," he said, "I'll have a word with the social secretary, see if you can support us." And the guy said, "Oh, that's really good of you." And then I looked around and went, "Oh my God." Yeah, so that's not quite how McCartney tells it. From his office, it's that it was his idea and he did the whole tour. Well, the whole tour was his idea. I just wanted one date on it. So it was a germ of the idea.
Yeah, I can see it. And clearly that was a bit of a game changer. When we spoke last week, one of the things I'd like to just bring out briefly, because my daughters are here, and particularly they were big fans of Linda, which is a real change in how popular culture has reflected on Linda McCartney's impact. But you told me a really lovely story.
Yeah, no, true. It's true. At that time, Linda was having not quite as bad a time as Yoko Ono had, but it wasn't far off. And the press were terrible about her. She was the hard-nosed businesswoman. She was McCartney away from the Beatles, and it was all that sort of stuff. And actually, I thought she was great. I mean, she was a really nice person. Totally different to what I'd imagined.
Yeah, no, I thought that was a lovely little story, and also it's quite interesting for social history. Those of us in the room, you can't help reflecting on your own experiences. Because my dad was a miner, so he was on strike in '72. So it's just kind of thinking about all these things that.
Can I tell a story? It's nothing to do with Lancaster University.
I think we'd love to hear it. Yeah.
After I left and was doing lots of shows. That we were doing a big fundraiser in Hyde Park for the big miner strike, the second one. So we got, I was with a couple of friends who were actually ex-students from here, but were working for Nalgo at the time, and they were seconded to do this big event. The Dockers Union had said, "We'll provide all the staff." So I said, "Oh, great, okay." So they had, and we'll provide you with an office, centrally. So we got 11 bands on, it's going to be good. John and I had gone out. I don't know what we were doing, but we were going out anyway. So we came back in the afternoon, and Bert was there with his fag on the desk, and they said, "Everything all right?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Oh, I had some Yank here." I said, "What?" Some Yank came in. He's got a group, and he wanted to play tomorrow, and I told him to piss off. And I said, "Oh, why?" He said, "Well," I said, "We've got enough bands. We don't need." But he was adamant. He really wanted to play. He was adamant, but anyway. He was really persistent. He didn't want to play. So I said, "Well, what was his name?" He said, "Oh, I don't bloody know." And he said, "Oh, wait on, I wrote it down." So he got down in the bin and got a fag packet out. And he said, "Bryce Sprungston," or something like that. And I went, "Did he leave a phone number?" He said, "Oh, he wanted to, but I told him to fuck off."
I'm not sure how often those words have been used in this library, but and also what I would apologise for is the feedback. But let's face it, you want the '70s rock experience, so we're making sure there's a little bit of that coming through. So Barry, I want to ask you something that the conversation sparked a memory. So 1972 was a bit of a year for you getting to meet charming pop stars, because later in '72, I believe Cliff Richard played.
He did. Well, I had nothing to do with me. Sorry, I didn't book it. It was. I did look it up the other day because I was just double checking that it was 1972, and it's on his Cliff Richard's sort of website and history of it. And actually, there's in one of the biographies of him. There's 3 pages dedicated to that show at Lancaster. He was something like Christians in Industry or something or other. So it wasn't Cliff in the Shadows. It was Cliff doing an acoustic set, a lot of prayers around everything. So the hall was sold out. The university got a bit nervous because they'd heard rumours that the GLF, the Gay Liberation Front, were going to demonstrate and cause a problem. So they asked me if I'd look after the show and get my stewards in and used to handling crowds, etc. So we did. And but the GLF came as a block in one corner, so there must have been about 100 of them, 150 in an 800 or 700 capacity, not because they were all seated, and they came in full drag, absolutely, like just so many drag queens in one trip, and they were just started trying to force Cliff to come out. To sort of come on, what are you doing, everything. And of course, he did lose his rag halfway, just towards the end, and he said, you know, what if I was to admit I was gay? What would that do? And did he just say that on stage? You know, I mean, most people have an educated guess, but you know, it had never been. So anyway, I saw him afterwards, and again, what a nice guy. I mean, he's one of the top 5 or 6 guys, and really nice. And he was quite sincere. He said, look, he said, I'm not going to have a meeting now, but get half a dozen representatives of that group. I will come up and talk to them next week. And he drove up in his Ferrari, and we did it in the chaplaincy centre, and he had a long talk with us.
That for me, I mean, when you read books like yours, you always look for what's the stories that kind of illuminate things you might not have known, or you've looked at it at a different angle. And that for me, you know, he could have said, I'll come back next week, then you never see him again, but that he came back and engaged in private. Was very telling. Now, we've mentioned the Beatles, and I am going to jump forward 10 years or so, because I will come back, but you can't mention the Beatles without the Stones. So ones that got away.
Regrets, I've had a few.
But then again,
yeah.
So what happened with the...
Yeah, it was 1983. I came back to the office, and my secretary said, you've got to phone Harvey Goldsmith's office. Harvey put a lot of acts in to Lancaster by that stage. He put nearly all his acts were coming into Lancaster. But Harvey Goldsmith was the promoter in Britain. You know, he did Live Aid and all this sort of stuff, right? So he said, "Can I have May the 14th for a band?" And I said, I doubt it, Harvey. Final starts usually around middle of May, and there's usually a moratorium for at least a week. I push it as much as I can, but it's because I don't want live music, because all the students who should have been working for 3 years suddenly decide to work for the last 2 weeks. So I said, well, I'll check it anyway. I checked it, and it was a Saturday night. Not only did final start that week, they actually started on the Saturday night. So I phoned Harvey and said, you can't. He phoned me 3 times that day about this date, and I said to him, I said in the end, I said, look, Harvey, what's it for? And he said, oh, I want to do a local band's rock and roll competition. And I said, Harvey Goldsmith does not do local band rock and roll competition. What's it for? And he said, well, I can't tell you. So I said, well, if there's any, I don't think there's any chance of getting it. He said, you've got to get it. And I said, I can't see I can get it, but I certainly can't get it if you don't tell me what it's for. He said, well, last week, Mick Jagger came into my office and said, this big European outdoor tour that we're doing, we want to do Lancaster as the first date. And they've all like 30,000 and 40,000 open air concerts, the Roundhay Park that year. And I said, what? And he said, yeah. I said, well, that's why. And he said, well, he was talking to Van Morrison. And Van Morrison said, look, if you're going to do anyway, you've got to do Lancaster. Lancaster is the best venue he's ever played in his life. And we had Van Morrison on twice. And so I can have a go. He said, no, you don't understand. Jagger came personally to tell me I've got to get it, so you've got to do it. And I said, well, I can't. Right. So I said, I did actually go to Professor Reynolds' office, and he said, yes, what do you want? I said, well, finals are starting on the 17th of May. I said, could you postpone them for a couple of days? And he looked at me like, why? And I said, because they were only songs. He said, Mr. Lucas, I knew I was in trouble as soon as he said that. Mr. Lucas, he said, students come to Lancaster to get degrees, not to go to pop shows. And I said, yeah, but if you ask them what they'd rather do on that Saturday. Anyway, he told me to go away. Slightly more polite than the porter, but it's the same kind of...
I love that story for many reasons, but partly because it must be one of the few incidents where Van Morrison's recorded as speaking positively about something. But I will bring it back to the mid-70s. I just had to bring those two stories together. And when I talk to anybody about the groups that played at the Great Hall or Lancaster University, the one I know will always shock people, because we tend to even forget he was ever really alive, not just a legend, as the Greatest Hits refers to him. So Bob Marley played. What's your recollection of Bob Marley playing?
I used to do Island Records back in this time, we're talking about early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, had the best roster. They had some of the greatest, all the great acts were on Ireland, British acts anyway, on Ireland. But Chris Blackwell set Ireland up, and he was brought up in Jamaica, and he was a big pusher of reggae. And the booker phoned me up, Rob Wynn. I was talking to him about 2 weeks ago, and I lived in Florida. But anyway, Rob phoned me up and said, look, I've got to organise this tour. Will you take a band off me? It's a reggae band. And I said, no, I don't want to. Look, I said, I quite like reggae to listen to. You'll get people to dance into reggae, but you don't sell tickets for reggae. Nobody's, and there were no reggae bands really doing anything other than small clubs. And he said, yeah, but this is Blackwell's pet thing, so I've got to do this tour. And so I can't do a tour without Lancaster being on it. So I said, I really don't want to do this. Yeah, look, I don't want any money for them at all. You can have them for free, but I've got to have an audience. So I said, well, the only way I can think of doing it is to put a disco on. So we put a big disco on in the Great Hall. So obviously, and I'd never heard of the band, so it didn't really, I couldn't go out and say, oh, come along and do whatever. So we just put a disco on. So we got about 1,000 people there to the disco. At midnight, I went on stage and said, ladies and gentlemen, we're ending now, but in a minute, a band is going to come on. They're going to be monstrous. They're going to be brilliant. I mean, I've never heard of them. How wonderful they were going to. Please stay. About 600 people stayed out of that 1,000. And they saw the second, because he did play a little club on the way up, some cricket club or something. The first real show in this country of Bob Marley and the Wailers.
April 73. So that must be about the time Catch a Fire was recorded and as you say, took off from there. But you had a long-standing relationship with Island Records, didn't you? There was quite a few, perhaps none more than John Martin.
Yeah, John Martin. We had him on as a supporter. I mean, I used to call it. We used like a one-man Pink Floyd on the stage, and he started off as a folk singer and then moved into sort of more electric and effects stuff. But his heart was in contemporary folk music. And eventually he moved from being a sports act to I would just headline him. I think I had him on the most of any act, about, I don't know, I think it's 7 or 8 times or whatever. And by the end, he was just selling out. And he used to sit on a chair in the middle of the stage. And after 2 numbers, the whole audience, well, not the whole audience, but as many as could get on, were sat around him on the stage. And he had this, the new Chancellor would love him. Talk about drip down. He used to light a joint and pass it round. And by the time it got halfway around, there's about 30 other joints arriving back, and he was sticking them in various strings and everything. And his shows went on forever. I mean, honestly, it was like the musical Ken Dodd. It was like 4 hours. And I was down with his manager staying with his manager in London, and we were drinking, and about 2 in the morning, if the phone rings, and he said, "Oh, it'll be John, drunk with some harebrained scheme he wants to do." So it was John, and I was saying to, look, I love putting John on, and we'll always put John on, but he really needs to sort of cut his set down, because people are staying out of love of him, out of a sense of duty, but actually they'd rather go home after about 2.5 hours. So anyway, Rob must have said this to him, because the next time I had Martin on, I got this Scottish irate voice going, "Oi, you!" I'm like coming over. What are you saying to my manager? No, God, thanks, Rob. Because he got a bit of a reputation as Mr. Martin for alcohol and violence.
Yeah, indeed. And I really wanted to bring up John Martin, because when we talked, you made it clear that if anybody kind of had the soul of those years, it would be John Martin, in the way, the amount of times, and how another one, it should have been live at Lancaster.
Yes, it should, and that ended up alive at Leeds. Yeah.
That
should have been. That wasn't an accident. That was Chris Blackwell did that, but he didn't. he didn't know of the atmosphere that was generated at Lancaster. Would have made a superb album.
Yeah.
Album.
I mean, what great years the Island Records were at that point. Absolutely. I mean, Solid Air would be a kind of recommendation for a starting point, I think. So, but I want to move us to the mid 70s, later into the 70s, and I want to hear what were the punk wars like here.
Well, if you look at the punk bands that we had on, we had everybody. I mean, everybody, except for one act. But it's really funny because I started up like most people at that, a lot of people at that time, talking about. I remember sitting in the slip-in. I used to own Era Records in Lancaster, and I didn't run it. My partner ran it, and we were sat in the slip-in one evening discussing punk. It just started, and we were sat. And I said, when did we grow into our parents? Because we were saying they can't play their instruments, you can't hear the voices, the songs are. It's too fat, it's too loud, it won't last. It's just a fad. That's what our mums and dads said about the Beatles and the Stones to us, in exactly the same words. But one of the guys who worked with us in the shop was really into punk, and so that we started playing stuff. And then suddenly it was, yes, I know now, I know what it's all about. So we did it all from the first echoes of it were things like the Rats and Stranglers and stuff like that. Elvis Costello, that's Stitch. And then on into the Ramones and the Clash and Susie and the Banshees and everybody, except for the Pistols. I did have the Pistols on, but by this stage it was getting too violent. It was getting a bit scary. There were gangs of kids. Football fans, basically Barrow, Blackpool, Preston, and Lancaster, just using the Great Hall, using the punk concert as an excuse to have a battle. And while you could control sort of 600 or 700, I knew the Pistols would be far bigger than that. So I was getting nervous about that. And I talked to we had a lady who was president, Maggie Gallagher, at the time. She was she was one of the Trotskyists, I think it was, and but she was gotten really well with Maggie. And I just showed her the pistol photographs of all the Pistol gigs and all the whips and the balls and chains and whatever else and leather and stuff, and said, I'm not sure we ought to be doing it. And she said, well, it looks terrible. I said, well, I wouldn't want to ban it myself, but if you told me I couldn't have it on, I'd be quite, and so I said, well, I don't think you should be sure. Oh, that's enough for me, right? So I cancelled it. And then about the last punk one we did was the Buzzcocks, and the Buzzcocks were one of my favourite bands. I was really upset. They played one number, and the mayhem in there, I just had the lights up and pull the power, and we weren't going. And I phoned the Preston Polly got a professional dance person by this time, lady, and I phoned her up and said, I've pulled punk, I'm not doing it anymore. You've got the vibrators on Saturday, be careful. And she said, oh no, we're fine. We never have any trouble here. I said, that's what I was saying, but really, anyway, she put the vibrators on and a student got stabbed to death that night. So, it was there, but for the grace of God, basically. Mm-hmm.
No, thanks. But as you say, so many punk groups played, and often, so we got over there in the exhibition, we got a great poster of the Damned, supported by the Adverts, great punk group 77, but also those great groups who played the Great Hall weren't always headlining. So John Cooper Clarke was third on the bill, something called Joy Division. And yeah, I'm not sure what happened to them. So again, all these great artists are continuing to play. And one of my favourite stories in the book actually is about, well, the Jam, but more about Paul Weller's dad, John Weller, who comes over as a real character. And again,
yeah, it was. We got that Jam on that the first big tour, the first where they were selling out that tour, and the two Weller brothers were managed by the band were managed by John Weller. It was just like it just walked off the EastEnders set. Really, it was just that Cockney market trader who you knew didn't believe what was happening to his lads, and he was going to milk it for all he could as quickly as possible before it all blew up. So we did it, and I got really well with him at Channel. Anyway, so the next tour they were doing, we weren't offered a date, and I couldn't. So I phoned up John Giddings, who was the agent at the time. I said, John, I haven't got a date on this jam tour, and I really want one. And he said, oh no, they're too big to play universities. I said, what do you mean? He said, no, we've had a meeting with the management, and we said it would be seen to be a backward step if we were playing universities. We're now one of the big boys. And I said, okay. I said, well, can you get hold of John Well, his dad? He said, the manager. So he said, yeah. Can you just tell him, Barry Lucas says, can you play Lancaster? He said, I'm not going to. He said, we've decided they're not playing university. I said, no, just tell him that it's a brown paper bag job and a gig never happened. And he said, what do you mean? I said, just tell him that. So anyway, about 2 hours later, he phoned me back, you've got a date. He said, I don't know what we said, what that was meant to mean. I said, I do, and John Welland does as well. So basically, he just got a brown paper bag full of £10 notes to spend. It didn't go through the tax man.
Yeah,
very naughty.
I think these are the great stories. It's not just who played, but it's those behind the scenes stories that I love. Now, I want to take us a little bit further into the 80s. We're 10 to 4, and technically this finishes at 4, but I think we're going to just kind of, like all good gigs, kind of just see how far we get till about 1:30. Oh yeah, absolutely. We'll keep going as long as you want us. Bus, just stay out all night. So I want to take us into the 80s, and one of the things I love about John Well, about Barry, his ideas and thinking is how progressive they were as we went into the 80s. Now, you had a brilliant suggestion and way of thinking about the ambition for the Sugar House. Can you take us through how you saw that and the Great Hall complementing?
Problem is the Sugar House has got lost. I got it's quite ironic really. The new copy of the second edition of my book, I found a whole load of letters from University House trying to stop the concerts over a period of about 12 years. What people are forgetting, Lancaster had a massive problem in 1972, and the university fragmented. Some members of staff were disciplined for bias in their teaching and their marking, which was patently not true, because I was told by them as well and know them. And they set up an alternative university. Over half the staff went with the student body of setting up an alternative. Panorama came up and did a whole hour-long programme on Lancaster and the Troubles. And Lord Taylor Blackburn was commissioned to write a report about it, what happened, why, etc. One of his recommendations, a chapter of his report, was about the fact that the disconnect between the university and Lancaster, and especially students and local people, and they're 3 miles up on a hill, and as he said, the only time Lancaster is relevant for most people, Lancaster University is relevant for most young people in Lancaster, is a Friday or a Saturday night when they come up here to the concerts. So he said there should be a social centre created in town where locals and students mix together. And we set about looking. So we set about in 1972 looking for that. And we eventually opened it in 1981. I mean, it took a long time, and again, it wouldn't have happened, not because of me, but it wouldn't have happened without a person who was there the whole time, because the student union president will push something if they're really into it, but actually they've only got a year to achieve it, and you're not achieving something like that in a year. What really surprised me was 2 or 3 years ago. No, I've just lost 3 years. I've got my life with COVID. About 4 years ago, whatever it was, I was given an honorary degree, ironically, for all the work I'd done with bringing the two communities together through the concerts. Despite the university trying to stop it. Nobody in the higher echelons, Vice Chancellor, the Pro Vice Chancellor, but had any idea that the Sugar House was not a student club. In fact, Mitchell's Brewery put a student club on it. Al Gordon was the president, said, if that's not down by tomorrow morning, I am getting a crowbar and taking it off, you know, because it wasn't a student club. What I wanted to do, we got to the stage where if you put on unless you put on a world superstar, people weren't going to the shows. And if you got 300 or 400 people to a show in the Great Hall, it felt a failure. It might not have been commercially or whatever else, or artistically, but it felt a failure. So I couldn't put on up and coming acts. I knew I was going to be big, but if I put them on, somebody would say, "Oh no, I'm going to Eric Clapton this week, and Tina Turner's on in 2 weeks' time, so I'm not going to say it, you know, whatever they are." So that was the idea of the Sugar House. The idea of the Sugar House was a meeting place, was where there were discos, but it was basically live bands. Now, Tony Wilson, Anthony H. Wilson, as he preferred to be known later on, Tony Wilson was opening the Hacienda at the time, and I phoned him up jokingly because he just, I knew Tony Wilson, and I was saying he's just paid £15,000 for a French architect to come over and design a factory that he can have a nightclub in. I said, well, I've saved ourselves £15,000 because we've got a factory, which is the Sugar House, it was the old architects department. And Tony Wilson said at the time that, well, for the first couple of years, he regards the Sugar House as the greatest, not threat to the Hacienda, but the greatest competition to the Hacienda in terms of getting acts, because some of the acts that we got, can I just read them out, please? I'm sorry, I've jotted them down because I can't remember off the top, but just the kind of acts we got in a 3 or 4 year period. So we've got Sisters of Mercy, Hanoi Rocks, Stone Roses, Happy Mondays, Travis, Julian Cope, Simply Red, The Mission, Grandmaster Flash, who've just been inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Orange Juice, Marillion, Go West, Eurythmics, Aswad, John Cooper Clarke, John Peel, Rick Mail, Ben Elton, the whole Young Ones show, Lenny Henry, Alexis Sale. They were just in the team, you know, and there are others as well, but that's just ones I picked out. I wanted that to be like the marquee of the North, that people would come to see bands there that they might not have heard of, but knew they were going to be, that they would be quality music. You might not think they were wonderful at the end of the night, but they were going to be good acts. And in a few years' time, you go, oh, I remember seeing them, you know, with a disco or something. So that's what would have happened. And then, unfortunately, after I left the student union, gradually it turned into a place where not only, well, no, local people weren't allowed in. I mean, I just wonder what would happen if somebody opened a venue in Lancaster with a big notice on saying no students allowed in here.
Should we try it? Now, I was saying to Barry earlier, I think that was absolute genius at that time, because for those of us who were around, that was when this great indie swell grew, who were playing these small clubs, and then by about 1990 onwards would have been filling the bigger venue, the Great Hall. Now, you mentioned somebody that I want to reflect on. Now, there's always been really talented women musicians, but if you look through lists of who were gigging, who were recording, the male dominance is something that seems quite shocking now, actually, when I look through. Obviously, we had Joni Mitchell's and lots of others, Kate Bush, throughout the 70s and into the 80s. But the one great talent who played Lancaster in 1984, which I think was a surprise to some people, was Tina Turner. Can you tell us about when Tina Turner came to visit?
Yeah, it was a summer term, and before Easter, Jeff Campbell, who did most of these photographs around and in book with my assistant then, I said to Jeff, we haven't got a big name for the summer term. And the summer term, you only had 4 or 5 concerts on because of finals, and then everybody disappeared anyway. So I said, well, let's go down to London and see who we can see. So we were going down to London, and I couldn't get anybody. We sat in the bar with Paul Loseby, who was a promoter at the time, who now is manager Jules Holland and Dave Gilmour, and Pink Floyd. And we sat in a pub having a lunch. And I said, Paul, I can't get a big name. He said, all right. So he went over to the landlady and said, can I borrow your phone? So I said, yeah, it's phoned up. And he wandered back over, sat down, said, would Tina Turner do you? I said, yes. Thank you. Tina she just started to come back. She'd had a very quiet period for a while, but she's just started to come back, and that had that great band with her. So yeah, so we had Tina Turner on, and it was probably one of the most embarrassing nights of my life because we let everybody up in the balcony. Normally Tina has a
his pal.
Tina Turner has an area backstage off, curtained off, where she could, because she does about 7 or 8 costume changes. So the manager sort of said, you can't really do that here because everybody's looking down, so she'll have to go back to the dressing room. So I was in the foyer with the tour promoter, Barry Marshall, and it was the first time he put an act into Lancaster. And suddenly the band manager came running in, absolutely going nuts, saying, your stewards have burst into Tina Turner's dressing room when she's getting changed. And I went, oh, God. So they got dragged backstage with these, and these 2 guys stood there, and I honestly, with a straight face, they said, well, we didn't understand. We thought Tina Turner was shouting for some help from stewards to get her out of her dress. And I looked at him and said, you've got me. And even the band manager's going, what? So anyway, so that was a bit embarrassing.
That I think was 84, possibly 83. She played on the private dancer tour. So as you say, when she was starting to come back in 1984, you left. Can you tell us about the kind of how you came to leave and?
Well, I did. There was 2 or 3 elements to it. One was that I was by that stage I was ancient at 34, and thinking if I stay much longer, I'm going to be a student for the rest of my life. But mainly, I was finding myself far to the left politically of my executives, and I was finding that really hard work. And instead, for years, because by then I'd been made student union manager. And for years, I'd be saying, you can't do that. That's ultra vires. You can't do it. Be careful what you're doing. The last 2 or 3 years, I was saying, well, you get up off your asses and do something. This government is destroying you, you know, and then they were cutting 25% out of higher education budgets and things. And I just found it very difficult. I didn't understand why Margaret Thatcher was cutting so much money out of higher education, and yet 65% of Lancaster students voted Tory in the general election. I couldn't believe it. So anyway, so I decided it was probably time to move on.
That's a very sobering thought. So
probably 80%.
So you moved on, and then by 1985, those golden days were over. You'd left, but do you know why the Great Hall ceased?
Yeah, it's quite simple, really. After I left at Christmas, Jeff Campbell was then given the job. Exeter University had asked me to do a feasibility study into them doing what we'd done here, because they had a 2,000-seater hall sat on the motorway at the beginning of a big cul-de-sac, basically. So, you know, Devon and Cornwall. So I looked and thought, well, you know, so I did the report and said that they should do it, blah, blah, blah. Jeff applied for that job, got it, so he left. He put on 2 or 3 good acts. I mean, he got New Order on, which I could only get Joy Division on. I tried to get New Order on and couldn't do it, and Jeff managed it. Then he left. They then brought in somebody, I think, from Leicester University, a lady from Leicester University, and they did about 3 or 4 shows in the autumn of that year, lost about £7,000-8,000, and then the student union just decided not to get involved in that kind of risky business anymore, because it was a different generation of management then. was a whole generation of student union managers from that who were students in '68, and their attitude, if the government had cutting us by 25%, how do we generate that 25%? Not how do we cut our staff and our expenditure to fit that in, how do we generate that 25%? That's where the growth in student unions in shops and travel agencies and every other structure.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, just a final reflection that you were fighting first the university, as you reflect in your book, and then student union. Yet, as I said to Barry at the start, the fact that we're sat in this room in the university library having this discussion tells us you won. History, you were on the right side of history, I would say, speaking very much as me, not the library director. I stress at that point. You were certainly on the right side of history when we hear who we had. So what I want to do now is give people the opportunity to, and I will happily run around with the mic if needs be. I won't ask you, Phil, to do it, or Tom. Do we have any questions for Barry, if that's all right? We have somebody called David Summers.
Yeah.
Oh, we've got to. It's we don't know if there's any.
All right.
Yes.
Okay. I was a student here from 76 to 80, and
right.
so a lot of those are wonderful memories. I have two, especially the Maggie Gallagher one, by the way, that she definitely got the blame for there being no Sex Pistols in my first year. So, but two memories. Just wanted to know if they bring anything to mind. In my second year, I went to what we then called the Grease Pit, which is probably Furness Refectory now. And at the table next to me, I was having a late lunch. The table next to me were Blondie, who were on that evening. And I didn't know that they ate with us mere mortals. And the second memory was during my finals, actually, Eric Clapton appearing on stage, playing beautifully, but he didn't appear to have much blood in his alcohol stream that night.
Very true.
Do either of those?
Yeah, Clapton had kicked the heroin habit and replaced it with Courvoisier, basically. And he had a very good guitarist backing him up. So that's true. The Blondie situation is it's actually through I said that I was taking I took over the rag balls mainly because the rag committees were great at organising parades through Lancaster and throwing flower bombs or little old ladies doing their Saturday shopping, but it lost its sense of humour, but they weren't very good at organising a commercial gig kind of thing. So I said, look, I'll just do the gig. You can have the money, basically. You put it on as a rag ball. And that year, I'd been in the Era Records, and I'd seen the cover of the 12-inch of the Blondie six that had just come out, and nobody'd heard of her really, but I knew she was touring. And once I saw the cover, I thought, this is not just NME and Melody Maker. This is going to be all the red tops are going to be all over. This is going to be massive. So I got an offer of a date, Blondie, and it was the rag ball day. So I said, yeah, and it was a straight fee of £500, which was unheard of in those days because they'd moved away from straight fees into straight fees against percentage fees. So if you sold out, you were giving 90% of what he took to the artist anyway, which is, fair enough. But this agent was a young lad and he didn't realise what he'd got, and he sold a whole total of 500 quid. He lost his job. But so I said to the rag, I said, well, okay, I've got your rag ball. Who is it? Blondie. And they said, they had a committee meeting. And then they came and saw me at the committee and said, we've never heard of her. We've never heard of this group. And I said, trust me. They said, no, we're not happy with this. So I said, honestly, trust me. So well, they couldn't do anything about it because I signed the contract. So that we did this. Two stories on the back of that. One is that when I was stood at the back of the hall with Debbie Harry, and the doors opened, and all these young lads rushed past us, knocking her over to get to front. I said, do you realise they're all running to get a better view of you as they're running past you, kind of thing? And she said, I know. And then on the Monday morning, when Al Gordon, the right president, was come up to the SRC reception, and I just had 2 black bin liners full of £10 notes, and said, "There's your money from the profit from the artist you've never heard of."
I think. I think I was stood there with Debbie Harry as one does. Any other questions anybody would like to?
Yes. You suggested, I think, in the book that one of your regrets was not getting Leonard Cohen, but you said there were sort of issues around that, about the riders and so on. Can you explain that?
Well, I found the contract, because I've just did a talk last week for the Lancaster bid, based around what was happening in 1972, and I've got the Leonard Cohen contract. I've got Leonard Cohen and Lou Reed are 2 artists that were contracted to appear but didn't appear. No, Leonard Cohen pulled the whole tour. I mean, the contract was crazy. It was like a limousine from Heathrow and a coach with friends. I loved the 6 bottles of wine of local vintage. So that was going to be Mitchell's Bomber. I was going to play. But yeah, it was sad, really. It was £1,450. I remember, the fee. But the rider was about that thick, and the agent from Island Records, it was 5 Island artists, and the agent just put "have fun!" ! Exclamation mark! Here.
Thanks.
It's nice to hear from you. I just want to say, my husband here talks about you for years and years, and all the gigs that he saw here. So here's the reason why I'm sitting here listening to these great stories. You've had a lot of success at the time at Lancaster, but I want to ask you just 2 things. So one is, what was the biggest loss that you ever made financially at the university? And also, you mentioned, say, Cliff Richard was in your top 5 or 6 nice guys, but who was the most difficult? Who was the worst person? I'm sure you can tell us now. Who was the worst person that you had to deal with?
There's somebody that I wouldn't go up and see anytime soon. Mr. Steve Harley. He was the most pleasant person I've ever met. So yeah, he's easy. We didn't have too much in the way of sort of tantrums and I mean, you alluded to it. There's that thing about Van Morrison, isn't it? That there's sort of 60% of the people who don't like Van Morrison. No, there's 40% of people do like Van Morrison, but they're the ones that I've never met him, kind of thing. Yeah, yeah, he was very strange. But I mean, I've held my hand up. he told Mick Jagger what a good place it was, so it can't be that bad. What was the other part of that?
Biggest financial loss.
Oh, biggest financial loss. That was who was it? Probably Renee.
Something you expected to do really well.
Yeah, Alison Moyer. Yeah, don't ask me why. I have no idea.
When was that? I mean, like 80s.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, she was monstrous. I mean,
yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean she was monstrous, but you know what I mean. She was a big star, and I don't know. But Van Morrison, the same. You see, Van Morrison, that first tour, he hadn't done a day anywhere for about 8 years, and he was just doing I think it was only 8 dates. So we were, Van Morrison said before he did it, right, I'm not doing stand-ups and I'm not doing universities. So that rather caused a problem, as Lancaster was a stand-up university. But somebody flew out to Los Angeles to say, you've got to do Lancaster. So he did it. Flew out. I mean, every ticket agency sold out an hour before they were going on sale, because all the agencies had to open. The police were telling record shops that to open up the queues. But we were the top floor on Alexander Square, the student union. I think we had people sleeping down the stairs and into students across the thing to get in. Second time I had him on, 18 months later, I couldn't give tickets away, and I don't understand why. Because the first show was a good show. It wasn't like he'd done a bad show. I have no idea. But then, you know, if I did know all the time, I would have been Ivor Goldsmith. No, a failed rock and roll promoter from the north of England.
There's a great story about Van Morrison, his band, and the exchange in Mart, but I'm just going to tell you to Google that one if you don't know it.
I just, if you could verify something, over the summer I was doing a vaccine taxi and dropping very old people to get their vaccines, and I asked this very old guy at the back saying, when was the last time you were at university? He said, oh, 1974. And I said, well, that's quite precise. How do you know that? And he said, well, I came to see Queen and they were supporting Humble Pie or something. Mott the Hoople. And he said, after the gig, I was sat at the bar with Freddie Mercury and Brian May having a beer. And he said, no one believes me, but I was. And I don't know whether to believe him or not.
Freddie Mercury did go in, well, I don't know what it's called now, but Cartmel Bar, there used to be a bar on the corner where Cartmel College has moved now, something, they've all moved, haven't they? But if you're going up the spine to the Great Hall, there used to be a bar on the right hand side there, Cartmel Bar. Yeah, Freddie Mercury was in there. Somebody lent him a jacket that night from the bar. He saw somebody wearing a leather jacket that he really liked, so the the trouble was, it was just a rip-off crowd. I mean, I paid them 50 quid that night. Outrageous. They were supporting Mott, right? So we got I think it was the fourth night on the tour, fourth or fifth night on the tour. They were meant to be doing an hour set. By us, they were doing 25 minutes because Mott's management was saying, you're not playing that long. It was cutting them down virtually every night because they couldn't follow them. They could not follow them. They couldn't walk on stage and follow Queen. I again, through the record shop, my business partner said, you've got to listen to this band. You've got on. Because I didn't book them. They just came as part of the tour. A year later, or 18 months later, when they were massive, then I had them on as part. They were only done a short day. They were only done about 8 or 9 days, but Lancaster was one of them. But that we'd listened to their band. Yeah. Nigel and I were stood at the back of the hall when the band were playing, and we just looked at each other and thought, if you wanted to be a rock and roll star, that's how you do it, really, isn't it? I mean, that was just, they were so bloody good. And what's really funny, especially that Mott day. I mean, Mott were a big band at that time, you know, all the way the Stones, all the Young Judes, all that sort of stuff. They had that affiliation with Bowie at the time. And we'd sold out. When Queen were on, there was about 150 people in that hall. Now, if you talk to people locally, there was about 2,500 in that hall that night because everybody was there and so on when they were supporting that. But they weren't. Most people were in the bar, you know, because yeah, that's what he did with support bands. I mean, some of the support bands people missed were just, you know, orchestral manoeuvres as a support band, Dire Straits as a support band. I opened the Gardens in Morecambe and we got Climax Blues Band on. And at the end of the night, there was only the one guy left, and there was a lot of young blues musicians with him. And I was sat on the drink and I said, I've had you on twice before, you know, in this area. He said, well, have you heard this? I said, yeah, Lancaster Town Hall for a freshers do. And then the Great Hall. He said, oh, yeah. I said, do you remember who was supporting you that night? He said, yeah. And all these lads were with him. And they said, Dire Straits were supporting you. They all looked at him like, where did it all go wrong?
Brilliant. I think we've got time for one more question, if anybody. Yes.
Barry, first of all, well done. Fantastic job putting Lancaster on the map in that way. You mentioned a few American bands in the lineups that you've had. You mentioned the Stone Roses and Bruce Springsteen. And I wondered if you ever thought you were either not in the league of, or you really wanted to have had but never did, some of the really big American names, you know, like Steely Dan or the Grateful Dead. Did you ever, you know, rub shoulders with any of those guys?
I didn't. I never turned those down. I never got offered them, basically. I mean, two of the acts that I do mention that sort of regrets that I was going to get, but unfortunately they couldn't turn up, as it turns out, was Jimi Hendrix and the Doors. Well, I've got them, but they had accidents before they arrived. Right. But I'd have loved to put Springsteen on. I got, funny, I've been sent 2 Springsteen albums by agents who would, you know, these are send you records if you've never done a band, so you hear this. And I'd never bothered playing them because I saw in that Rolling Stones article which said Bruce Springsteen, the future of rock and roll. So I didn't bother. I thought it was all hype. And after we got Leonard Skinner on, Paul was promoting it, was staying with me, and we're at 2 a.m, drunk, and he said, "Have you got any Bruce Springsteen?" I said, "Yeah, but I've never played it." He said, "Oh, you've got to play it." So I put it, but Born to Run on, and like, future rock and roll.
I think that's a great place to end. I think the lady, you put it brilliantly. Thank you, Barry, for putting Lancaster on the